I think that one of the things that's really important when you're designing a system with integrations is to understand those boundaries. And so, where does your system stop and another system start? And where you might have developed a system and realized that you tried to do it all and you weren't then meeting those needs, and you then suddenly have to plug in another system. But from an end user, that gets quite confusing because the boundaries between your system and another system aren't clearly defined.
We're talking integrations with Sentral co-founder Ant Mawer. Why are they needed? How do they work? And how do schools plan for the transition to Sentral? All that coming up in this interview. I'm Colin Klupik. Let's get straight to it. And I'm going to start with something which is fairly high level and that may seem obvious, but it's probably also a lot more complicated than it sounds. And that is, why do we even need integrations? And can't Sentral just do everything?
That's a great question, Colin, and one that we hear a lot, that in any organization, nobody wants to think about deploying more systems than you actually have to. And so the appeal of a system that does it all, so that you've only got one system to deploy and implement, is something that's really appealing to most people. Unfortunately, in software, and particularly when it comes to management systems, that idea of jack of all trades, master of none is all too true. And what you inevitably end up with the idea of a system that's going to try and do it all is it does a lot of things and does a lot of them very shallowly. And as a result, you end up with a lot of workarounds and gaps. And so when we first started out, we looked around to see what was out there in the market and how they were currently working in schools, and came up with a view that we weren't going to try and do it all, be very clear about what it is that we would do. And then we would need to integrate with other systems in order to fill those other roles that had to be completed within a school.
Now, so you've made the decision to not be the one system, and this might sound like another fairly simple question, but you've explained a little bit about it, but why is Sentral really good at that?
I think that one of the things that's really important when you're designing a system with integrations is to understand those boundaries. And so, where does your system stop and another system start? And where you might have developed a system and realized that you tried to do it all and you weren't then meeting those needs, and you then suddenly have to plug in another system. But from an end user, that gets quite confusing because the boundaries between your system and another system aren't clearly defined. Whereas for us, we had the advantage of embracing integration from the beginning. And so being able to work through, okay, well, if we're going to design those boundaries, where are they going to be? Where do we finish our system and where do those other systems take off? And so we actually designed a user experience that was considerate of those boundaries in such a way that the end users didn't end up feeling like they were jumping back and forth between systems, but rather they work seamlessly together. And I think that's been really key to how we've thought about integration across the entire Sentral experience.
Well, let's talk about something a little bit more specifically then in terms of how those things talk to each other. And let's talk about something that might be a little bit more specific towards independent schools. Now, I would imagine that something like timetabling is fairly consistent across all schools. However, can you give us a couple of examples as to where Sentral can really meet the independents?
Look, and timetabling is a great example where there are different ways of approaching it, but fundamentally the same core concepts. But if you think about independent schools, and really they've got their own unique value propositions, they've got many different sizes in terms of the number of staff they might need to manage. And so HR is a great example where the level of maturity of your organisation in the school, the number of staff you've got to actually manage in there, where they might be physically located can be vastly different from one independent school to another. And so as a result, there can be a lot of different systems that might fit your need in terms of what an HR system you might need to actually support the running of your school. And so the great advantage of work here is that we've got an ecosystem of different HR solutions that you could choose from, and any one of those can meet your needs. So you get the benefit of what Sentral can provide to any school, coupled with the ability to choose the right size system for your school. And maybe your school grows, and so it might acquire additional sites, and you might find that you start off with a fairly basic HR system, where you bring in a director of HR, you open additional campuses, you start to deal with international potentially. And so that might mean that you need to move. You can now change that one piece without having to pull apart your entire school ecosystem. And so that's a really, really powerful situation in terms of future-proofing your investment in systems in your schools.
Now, you've described a situation there where I would imagine there'd be a lot of data. And if I've got lots of different systems and then Sentral comes into the mix, isn't it the case that I'll now no longer be able to report reliably across these data sets with ease?
Look, I think it's a really outdated misconception that we see, that a lot of people grew up with management systems where the only way to report on things was to get all that data into one system. And so they would feed everything into their student management system and then report against it. If we look at how modern systems work in other businesses across the world, that's evolved quite significantly from there, where we now tend to see a data lake and data warehouse as the foundation piece for how you manage data in an organization. And so for us, the understanding is that an independent school is going to be no different to that. You've got a lot of different data sets. You're going to have multiple different systems out there in the school. But from an organization perspective, you need to be able to manage, report, and interoperate with that data in different ways. And by actually building a data warehouse alongside your different business systems that are deployed in the school, that's going to give you the maximum capability to actually report across all these things instead of a siloed view of what's happening within your school.
That sounds like you're describing something which is potentially a very large situation or a very wide situation. A question that I have is Sentral big enough? For example, what about multi-campus schools or schools where you might have quite a large junior school that's connected to an equally large senior school, and in some cases they might not even be on the same campus? I imagine there'd be some complicated relationships to manage with respect to those data and those systems. How does Sentral go about handling that? Is it big enough?
I think that's one of the things that works really well in terms of our approach, Colin, in terms of being able to right size the solution in such a way that it can scale up and down. So if we think about the idea of the product, we've got very clear boundaries about where the product itself finishes and where we're bringing partners to support on that. But in terms of a solution that can scale from a small individual little school to a multi-campus to an international there, that you can actually grow within the Sentral product to cater for all those different needs. And that's one of the real unique things about Sentral is the ability to deploy that in such a way that as an end user, if you're working maybe in a particular state-based campus of an independent school, you interact and deal with just your particular school and state's data. But all that actually sits within one instance of the application where your other sites are also in there. And from a whole of enterprise point of view, you can manage, integrate, and work with those. And it's really, really compelling when you start to look at chains of independent schools running multiple sites, or either within one state, multiple campuses, or running the national or international operations.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the small independent school in there as well, because I've got an FAQ style question coming up shortly about that, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But again, thinking about the transition, or for schools thinking about the transition, either small or large, again, it's sounding very complicated. How long should they realistically plan for to make a transition like this? I mean, what sort of time frame are we talking about?
Look, there's no such thing as a one size fits all model, but in many cases, we would generally suggest you're looking at a sort of 12 to 18 month journey in terms of the end to end change management. Now, some people might want to go faster, some people might want to take it slower. And the most critical part is the change appetite of people within your school. One of the things we fundamentally discourage is the idea of big bang, that you're dealing with a school that's got students in classrooms, you've got parents out there in the community. You can't stop running your school to go and do an IT system change. And so it becomes really critical that you can go out and deploy this capability in a way that your staff can actually adjust to and adapt to that change and come along the journey, but also the opportunity for you to refine and learn as you go as well, so you can improve the next iteration. And over the many years of implementing Sentral, we've developed some really robust frameworks to work with our customers to work out where they're going to maximize getting value out of the product as quickly as they can, while looking to manage the risk of the overall rollout program and making sure that you don't end up with change fatigue in your staff members within the school.
Well, let's talk about some of those staff members. I've also asked this next question to some of our other guests in the series, and I encourage our viewers to check those out, available on YouTube. But I'm going to ask you this as well. Who are the people who are most impacted by making a change like this? And let's look at this from the perspective of who needs a seat at the table when planning for it.
I think the reality of any change is that the key to success is actually your change management, consulting with stakeholders. And if we look at a school, we've got a number of significant segments. The most critical one is getting a teaching staff on board. So they typically make up the majority of the population of your employees within a school, and making sure that they are on board and that they're going to feel that this changes the way that they operate for the better. It gives them better insights to what's happening with their young people. They've got better ability to undertake their administration responsibilities with less time. But then from a school leadership point of view, it's important they feel like they're going to better support better decision-making, compliance, adherence within the school. And then your business managed in terms of how is the financial going to be played out in terms of billing out to parents. Now, you've also got to consider the needs of parents in here as well. So when we bring that school community in there, well, what are they actually asking of the school in the 21st century? What are their expectations in terms of how they engage with your school? And how do we better make sure that in implementing a system, we're going to be responsive to those needs and actually considerate of it as well?
That's interesting. You mentioned that 21st century reference there, because Sentral is a product that has evolved and changed quite a bit over time. But then again, so has education. And again, of course, so has technology. Where do you see Sentral developing its future capabilities?
There's probably two key aspects for us. The most significant one that we've been focusing on in recent years is really bringing that parent community in. And so, if we think about a lot of the things where Central's grown up and has really been supporting the operation of the school, historically, a lot of that was focused internally to the school. So, the things that happened behind the front office, within the classroom, how do we make them more efficient and more effective? But increasingly, we're bringing those parents in. And so, trying to replace channels like email with digital workflows, online forms, and other things that allow people to go through and actually complete activities in a digital self service manner rather than relying on people to people interactions, the only means of getting it done. What that does free people in the school up then is for higher quality engagement with parents where they genuinely need to, rather than as the only means of parents getting information about what's happening in the school. As we think forwards, what we do look at Central is the incredible amount of data that we're able to capture in a highly structured manner and the opportunity to leverage new technologies such as AI to better drive insights in terms of what's happening within the classroom. How do we make sure that the students who might need the intervention are identified quickly, the appropriate interventions come in to really help each student recognise the best potential that they can be?
Now, look, I'm glad that you've mentioned AI. Something that immediately came to mind when you were talking about that is, okay, we want to bring the parent community in, get them involved, and then there's the reference to AI. Is that something that we should be mindful of, a little bit frightened of? The AI generation seems to be very popular in conversation these days around educational technology.
I think the most considerate thing that we can do around AI is understand what its opportunity it brings us, but be very very aware that there are risks inherent with that. And so, from our perspective, it's a matter of understanding the capabilities of what the potential could be, where it can benefit, and the opportunity to better help student outcomes. But knowing that we have to be incredibly cautious in terms of how we manage student data as we go forward there. There's a lot evolving, the technology is moving incredibly rapidly there. And I think the key thing is to make sure that we're open and transparent in terms of that journey and where we go, how information is shared and used, and making sure that the appropriate controls are in place at any point in time.
That concludes part one of my interview with Sentral co-founder Ant Mawer. Be sure to check out part two, where we dive into some FAQs for schools considering the transition to Sentral and how it integrates with current and future systems. There's a link in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe. I'm Colin Klupik, and we'll see you in the next one.